Selectors, welcome back to the Life First podcast. I am Andrew, and we are doing one more update on the new decks that are coming into the format. As always, we do a little bit of a tier list update, and this one's got a little bit more research than my normal ones do because I am prepping for the GP. So I think this is a pretty solid idea of what to expect in terms of tiers. As it stands right now, what are we at? Set 11? Set 11 format. I do feel pretty confident about these changes. I'll go over them very quickly, and then at the very end, we'll talk quickly about the updates to the cube, in case you guys are interested in that type of thing. So, I think at the top, we've got Tama Clear Aggro. It's been just continuously performing pretty well. It's just solid. It's just a solid build. It 50% is basically against the entire metagame and then has some good matchups as well. So I think it's pretty close to A tier. I don't think it's S tier yet. I'm not confident. It has some matches it still loses in, I think. And it could maybe be exploited, but those matches are very far in between, and also you can kind of pair against them. So I think Tama Aggro gets the dubious honor of rising to the top of Wixoss, which I guess is fitting, depending on if you watch Wixoss, the Wixoss lore. Tama seems to be top tier, so yeah, that makes sense. Following that very closely, I think all of these not very far off from Tama here, but all a collection of solid choices for A tier. It's going to be Remember, Madoka, Vogue X2, and Deus. So Remember is a discard control thing, and also Madoka is also similar to that, where it's a control sort of thing. The difference is that Remember is a little bit better at filtering through its cards, and Madoka is a little bit better at just gaining raw card advantage, and also that Elrig freeze is actually pretty good as Tom's gotten better. The Elrig freeze has gotten better itself as well. And I think that these two pretty much fight over which is the best control deck constantly. I honestly don't know which one's the better one. And then coming in here at the bottom of A is Deus Adams. So Deus Adams is not necessarily gotten any new cards or has gotten anything better. I just think it's just solid. It's just a solid bill. It pretty much beats most everything in the B range. Doesn't necessarily beat the stuff in the A range, but being that it's the top deck of B, and then can give these guys a run for the money, puts it in A range. I think it's very solid for the bottom of tier A. Jumping down, one thing also I did, you'll notice, is that I uninflated a lot of this tier list. This tier list was getting pretty big in terms of all the decks that it was covering, and I felt like that was unfair in terms of like what actually happens with tiers. As the game gets more bigger, right, the divide to get into these top two tiers should be more restringent. So I've pushed a lot of things that were in A tier into B tier, a lot of things that were into B tier into C tier, and a lot of things that were in C tier either out of the tiers or into D tier. So we see the first couple victims of that in this over here. I've dropped X, for example, X and Deus team aggro out of contention from being an A tier. This is still a really, really good aggro deck, and it's probably the best aggro deck still, with the exception of Tama, clearly. It's just kind of missing some key points that make, like, Tama's able to pretty much deal with any threat that's put in front of it, whereas X needs to have the answer to that threat in order, like, either it needs to be assassin or it needs to have some kind of resistant effect, like can't be tapped down. But it's a lot of A plus B, and if you don't have the right pieces, it can kind of fall apart on you, and you've got to dig for those pieces, whereas Tama just seems to have those pieces naturally built into it, which is why I've dropped it out of A tier. Some newcomers, and you'll see that's what these sort of like snowflake marks mean, is Remember midrange. There's been some hubbubaloo about black-red, basically, using Remember. It's almost reminiscent of what X midrange looks like, but just with Remember as the center. Like I said, you have to find those pieces, and that's what makes X a little difficult to run, but Remember is a consistency piece that does that, so it actually runs very, very little white. Mostly it's a black-red deck with like lots of lane opening and assassin. So I think that's actually pretty clearly the top of B tier. I haven't tested it really enough to know if it should sneak into that A tier at all, but I think it's a pretty strong contender. After that is Sachet. So Sachet is a real deck. There's a very specific way that you need to build it. It's a stall deck, right? So it's almost reminiscent of what Nova was back in yesteryear, where you throw up walls, you sort of protect yourself. But unlike Nova, it actually has damage output, and Nova doesn't really have a ton of damage output. Sachet does. Sachet has some damage naturally built into the Elrig deck, a clock, which means that Sachet Stall is actually a pretty real deck. There's a lot of restrictions on it. It's very tight on enter. It's very tight on its hand. It uses so discard and enter burning or enter starving can do a number on Sachet. So I can't justifiably put it into A tier, but I do think it's a real deck. Whether it stays top of B tier or mid of B tier, I don't know. I'm just going to go ahead and say top, just because I feel like that's a better placement for it. Mel hasn't changed. Mel has gotten a few new cards, has evolved a little bit to be a little bit more proactive, which I like about it. It's still very definitely green-black. It is just still good stuff, right? You're probably pairing white with that to still try to put out some walls to help you get into a little bit of the later game. You're drawing a bunch of cards with green's effects. You're charging a bunch of cards with green's effects and drawing a bunch of cards with black effects as well. So I think it's still very good. It seems to have a good matchup against the more control-ish types of decks because it kind of just shoulders through the damage regardless. So I think it ends up staying pretty good. It has certain tools. The thing is, it's spread a little thin with its tools. One of the major boons that I just got, by the way, is Barbarian. I do actually think Barbarian is a very legit card. Green was a little passive, and it also there wasn't much reward for playing green in green. I think Barbarian is a reward, because it gets over some of those white, sort of like stalling level 1s that you might want to play against a deck that's trying to deal damage to you. So I think Mel stays the same. It probably would have fallen a little bit if it didn't get any cards, but it did get some cards. Also got the new Midoriko, which I think is a pretty good one. I don't think it's an amazing one, but it's definitely a good anti-aggro tool. I've dropped Tama discard control down to the middle of B tier. It's still a good deck, is the issue. Like, it has everything you need, which is the control shell in the assist line and the everything else. I mean, this is the thing that I took to GP, so I don't love watching it fall. But it's just not quite as consistent as Madoka 2 and Remember. I was talking to the people who were running Madoka at the GP, and like a couple months ago, I was just like, yeah, Madoka 2 is really just the superior control Elrig for the center than Tama was. If I knew that in the GP, I probably would have taken it. The next thing is the Aya deck, Ayai deck, which is a new one. I've got a video came out recently about what I've been doing with it. I think it's a very interesting, unique build. The fact that it puts so much damage pressure, and it can either put that damage pressure out immediately, or it can piecemeal that damage pressure out, so it can be more of a mid-range deck, or it can be an aggro deck, depending on what matchup you're currently against and you need. I actually think is really strong. So I like this deck. I'm going to take it to some more serious testing. I think it might be maybe Mel and II should maybe be switched, depending on if II's less passivity is more important than Mel's sort of utility and long-term usage is better. I don't know which one is better, but that's something that could be probably swapped. There's also a Milulun here. So I've got Milulun Spellslinger. It's Rose up from C. I think it's a good deck. I think it's a solid deck. It spreads itself a little thin. It's definitely able to get milled out pretty easily, because it does blow through its deck, even with the anti-mill technology that's sort of built into it. It still blows through its deck. And there's just certain things that you can put out against them, and there's not really much they can do about it. But if you don't, it's one of those decks that's like, it's just so strange, because it's so built differently than everything else, that it can just, there's times that it can just blow through you, right? Like in Magic the Gathering, there are these, you look at some of the ban list stuff, and you look at Why is this random weird card banned? It seems innocuous. And the answer is because when you put that paired with another random innocuous card, it is just insane. Um, Milaloon has vibes like that, where it feels maybe not as consistent as I'd like, but it is so explosive. So that's why I'm putting it towards the bottom of B tier, probably the beginning of the bottom of B tier, along with Dashiron. Dashiron's got literally the same thing. It's aggro, not necessarily combo. But it is just, there are, like, at my locals, one of my new players who was playing with Hirana, because it's one of their first times playing, just swept everyone. Just swept everyone, even though they were pretty new to the game. And it's just like Hirana Dash Hirana can just do that. It's just that strong. It's not always consistent though, because there's probably the next time you play against it, you get 3-0 and you're 0-3 and you don't win a single game because it's just like you didn't burst well, you didn't have the cards in hand or something like that. It's an inconsistent deck, but very, very, very powerful. Aya has gone a little up in my estimation. That's because of the new Remember card, the one that bounces for a blue. Aya, the issues with Aya was it was very it was a little more passive than you'd like. There wasn't a ton of ways to open lanes. It was also very white heavy, because you wanted to stick all these like white Enter Starve things into it, but it was very much almost a mono blue deck. And it was a little difficult to work. Like, you could discard them away, but then you have all these extra discard cards in the mid game and late game that didn't quite matter anymore. All these things mean that the Remember blue bounce something to the opponent's hand is actually much better in this type of deck than it is in most other types of decks. So it just, I put it as a 4 of in the deck. It really unlocked this deck to be a little bit faster, a little bit more consistent. Isn't a huge major gain for Aya, but it is a big enough gain that I think it's worth to say that Aya has crept up a little bit. Carnival, so the more and more I play Carnival, the more and more I have it here as the red, black, blue version. My version is white. Let me just go ahead and make that change. So I like an Enter Starve version of Carnival. It can be blue, and I think blue, red, black has its merits. I don't know if it has its merits more than X does. It does sort of the same thing X does, with a little bit more of being able to filter, but then at that point maybe you want to play Remember instead. I like Carnival as more of a tempo mid-range deck that doesn't necessarily run that same way. The next thing that we have here is Yuzuki. Now, Yuzuki is a kind of an interesting one. It's at the bottom of B tier. There's a bunch of different ways that you can play it. You can either play it as an aggro Enter Burn deck, or you can play it as a mono white with Enter Starving with just some red Enter Burn elements to it. Or you can play it as a full-on aggro deck. All of these options are pretty available and available and good. I also should say that I built that one. They also are, they're all very valid, is what I'm trying to say, as long as you're sort of doing the correct core. And I think it is the bottom of B tier, because as far as just true red aggro decks, Carnival doesn't quite hit that mark, and X doesn't quite hit that mark. So Yuzuki does actually do sort of the spiritual successor of what like Team No Limit was. So I think this is a solid choice if you're gonna go for the bottom of B tier to if you just enjoy that red white aggro feeling. Then we've got the split. Again, the split is just like things that I don't necessarily build the decks of or have updated on Dexys. I just don't do much with it when it comes to this type of thing. I've got Ymir Death and Taxes. Actually got a buff this set. But I still think the core ability of basically putting out a Musica and a Gaybog and a Calypsidra out in basically and making your opponent discard their hand, enter burn, like you have no enter, is pretty good. The issue is it really doesn't turn on until turn 4 or 5, and at that point it really starts its engine going. And if you can get to that turn 4 or 5 safely, which is difficult because you have to play all these like stacks loxing pieces, but you also need to those stack locking pieces are not necessarily survival pieces to get you to turn 5. So you end up in a very strange sort of like tiptoe balance between trying to survive and stall the game out while simultaneously trying to attrition the opponent out. It's also similar to Mugen in that respect. Both these things don't turn on till like turn 5, and that's their core issue. Should the game slow down, right now I think we're in a turn 5, turn 6 meta. Should the game slow down and we end up in a turn 7, turn 8 meta, I think these decks could bump into B tier. Both of them, however, as it stands, are a little too slow for my liking, a little too passive for my liking, and thus have not really broached past C tier for them. The new Mugen is no exception. I think the best way to build Mugen is white and blue, and I'm pretty resolute in that thought process. People have talked to me about like white and green builds, which I also think are maybe viable. I've also heard some whisperings of like white and red builds. Either way, I don't think those are the greatest version. I think Mugen's biggest thing holding it back is the fact that I can't run any color it wants to under the rainbow. I think a colorless center where you can be as greedy as you want with your card choices in terms of color is the biggest draw that Mugen can have. But currently, as we don't have that color rule, not something I'm very interested in playing currently. Midoriko Stompy has gotten a buff, and that buff is Barbarian. The fact that you can now play Barbarian and kind of wipe the board later down the line is good for green aggro. I think that is a buff for green aggro, but you'll still see that it's dropped out of B tier for me. I have not had solid games with it. I think II does what that deck does better, being that it just has a little bit more layers to it. It's not just straight aggro. It has the ability to go longer. It has the ability to toolbox a little bit. I don't think Midoriko can really do those things, and as such, I don't really love the Stompy of this deck. However, it's still a valid deck, which is why it ends up in C tier. Maybe there's a concoction of it that I'm not really thinking about. If you do, link it to me in the comments down below. I'd love to look at it. The control deck of Mugen we've talked about. The next thing is Nova 2, which is kind of an interesting one. So you'll see Nova 2 is the sole riser of basically being untiered to suddenly C tier. And I don't know if it's teams so much anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and put down white B. And there we go. So Nova 2 has an interesting ability which lets you basically stack the top deck of your library, and you also draw things too off of it sometimes, and you get to pull those things from your trash. So the new Umir and Tawul combo with Oodles is a combo-esque deck, and stacking your deck actually allows you to play those cards immediately, so for cheaper than you normally would. So just on the straight up, now there's a combo that supports this maybe slightly lackluster ability that Nova 2 had, suddenly skyrockets it in usability. I think it's a very real deck. It still has a lot of the same issues it had before, which is sometimes outside of this combo it can be a little clunky. But I think if you're a Nova stand, this might be something you want to try. I also think it's the deck that uses that Oodles Reanimator combo the best out of all of them. Theoretically, you can use them in Remember at the top over here in the top deck. That seems like a very strong place to play it. You could also play it in this mid-range Remember deck. Sachet if you're feeling spicy. I think it's a very solid combo. I just haven't had the ability to test it a ton. It's something I'm looking forward to doing. But I do think that in theory, the Nova 2 deck should be able to support it the best. Then we've got Tamago, how the Mighty Have Fallen. It used to be up in A tier. It's over here down. It's just the more and more and more you do it, the more and more it's like freezing one or two Signy is not necessarily like people will just have card draw power to replace the frozen Signy. It's not really giving you an advantage. The random discard has gotten maybe slightly better because now you can have a better chance at hitting a guard off of it, and that is better. You also get a lot of random discard in Musica though, and it's not necessary. It's when you want it, you can basically play it. Sorry, Madoka. So I just think that the Tamago 2 has fallen a lot because of that. Japan, there's a new Tamago coming out, which seems kind of cool, but not here in the US right now. Okay, so then I've got some Atomic here. I put Eldora and Miko in the same place. Atomic Shell is still quite strong. I don't think these are the best centers for it, but I do think that the Atomic Shell, as just being able to constantly open up lanes and have a problematic H2O, is just a strong package, right? And Eldora and Miko still seem to be the strongest blue deck that you can pair with it to do the thing. Yes, you could also put, let's just go ahead and do Alos. Paraluke as another option for it. I guess I'll do the thing to make it more visible. I think that also is a valid option if you're trying to go with the Alos Paraluke. I think that's totally fine. I just don't think Alos Paraluke gives you enough damage output that it justifies it over, for example, Deus. Moving right along, I've got Bang 2 here. This is personal privilege still. Maybe Bang should be in D tier. I actually do think that the Midoriko being added to the deck, as well as Barbarian to the deck, has actually made it a much, and I have built it myself, thank you, has made it a very, very strong deck again. Would I say it's better than the Power Crept Ai or Mel? No, I wouldn't. But there's a deck there that these two decks don't have. This deck has Easy Lancer and has the ability to Enter Charge, which these decks don't. So there's still a small niche for Bang 2. As such, I think it's fine to round out the bottom of C tier. Lion Endless Punchline combo also can round out the bottom of C tier. It really just hasn't gotten a new card in ages, is the real issue for it. It needs to have consistency pieces thrown into it. So like Haniels, for example, while simultaneously being aggressive. Or if it can't be aggressive, it needs to have a stronger combo turn. Which there's no extreme way to do that right now. So like, if there was a way to basically get rid of your opponent's hand or make it impossible for you to guard, which is still likely, with Remember and your Team Signy, and then you go for the Endless Punchline combo, it's pretty good. I think if when you attacked with Lion, you were able to trash the things instead, like that would skyrocket it back into B tier for me, right? Is like if there was a way to basically tax guards, but also not let them have the enter from when you hit every time with Endless Punchline, I think it could go up further. Likewise, if there was ways to be aggressive with this deck while also fixing, so for example, if there was like scry the top 3 cards of your deck, put 2 to the bottom, 1 to the top, reveal the top card. If it's a level 3, vanish target Signy 8,000 or less. Something like that, right? Like, if those types of cards were introduced, there would be more consistency and aggression into this deck, and I could push it up more. As such, it's just lack of flexibility. It's been the same deck as it has been since set 1, is not quite good enough to push it past C tier, bottom of C tier for me. All right, so the last stuff in D tier, these are the things that I think are still worth being played at locals, but not necessarily worth really running at a GP or ceremony. Is Mayu. It's a good stuff deck. I think the best build that you can make out of it ends up being this deck where you're just constantly opening up one small lane every turn and then pushing damage through. There are decks that do that better. So it ends up being just an okay strategy. Iona's still an okay strategy to me. In terms of mid-range black decks, it's still probably one of the better ones that you can run. But it doesn't necessarily have anything that's super fantastic for it. It has a board wipe, but a board wipe that you are going to get attacked for and have to pay for. I think if it didn't have that enter cost, maybe it could be in C tier or even B tier. But that enter cost does a lot to keep it down. Musica Cosmos aggro, it's still an aggro deck. It's still strong. It still punches in damage. But it really doesn't do much other than that. It's not like got a toolbox. It's not got a very consistency piece. It's not enter burning necessarily. It's not doing double crush necessarily. Like it's just, it doesn't have a lot going for it other than it puts out damage. And all of the aggro decks that you can see here in A and B tier have other things. Thomas starves you out. Enter wise. X has got pieces that make it difficult to interact with. Carnival has ways to vanilla out Signy. Like, it's like this is the issue with Cosmos aggro. It just doesn't quite get you there. Sanga somehow still surviving as the D tier representative, although I think it did drop a little bit, as just like its niche is that it enter charges and also plays multiple colors, and it's still doing that. So nothing really new for it. Just green got a little bit better, so it also didn't disappear totally. At sadly is still got a niche in the fact that its team piece is obscenely strong. But when you pair the fact that sort of like Midoriko Stompy does kind of what At is doing better, Ott is doing better, it's just not necessarily great. And then pair Luke over at the bottom, it's just, I think, pure representation is keeping it here in D tier. It doesn't exactly do anything different than Tamago discard or Tama discard or Remember discard or Madoka discard. But it exists, and thus it is still very represented, so it should still be on your radar. So those are the decks. Going over the cube, if you guys haven't ever seen the cube, we have a cube video up about how to run our team cubes. It sort of just represents sealed and allows you to play sealed with your friends over and over if you want. It's a little bit more consistent, though, because I've taken out a lot of different things in it, so that way it only has the life bursts available, so everything is life bursts. There's always servants available. There's always good pieces available, good assist lines available, unique to each team. This is the deck. You guys can just pause it if you need to. I also provide a link in the description where you can download this PDF file and see it for yourself. And then there has been some changes, actually a fair amount of changes here. So as always, I don't add any secret rares or anything super high rarity. Rare is the highest rarity that I use because I want this deck to be affordable. So everything in this is like $2 tops, mostly 7 cents. Like it's very cheap to build. The goal here is to make it so that it's something that you could play with your friends if you want to play Wixoss, but not necessarily keep up with the Joneses. And I've changed out a lot of, here's the things I've taken out of the last time, and here's what I've replaced it with. There's a lot of good green stuff that got replaced, a lot of cool colorless spells that have been able to be added to the cube, and I think have made the deck a bit, or have made the cube more consistent in terms of gameplay, and then just some better life bursts to replace out things that were just worse, and I was kind of waiting on replacing them out. A lot of level 3s, for example, that are just not, you just don't get a lot of life burst level 3s in Wixoss at the low rarities. I think these are better cards in general for it. Overall, I think this is a really good increase to the cube. I actually think this cube is very playable at this point now, and I'm pretty happy with it. I'm still waiting on a couple assist lines to unlock the last sort of like decks that I want to run theoretically. I could be running a Sandbaka, but I'm waiting for the new centers to come out for that. I think these are choices that you can make. I've tried to base them based on the teams that exist in Wixoss. So that's one of my goals. Like, for example, where is it over here? Urith has a team that exists in Wixoss. I didn't update it yet. Anyways, So yeah, here it is. Urith, in the latest story of Lore of Wixoss, has a team with Remember and Nanashi. We don't have the Remember assist line yet, though, so I can't run it. Anyways, give us a whirl if you want. Every time I crack this out at like a bar or something for our locals to play with, it seems like everyone really likes it. So let me know what you guys think. All right, see ya!